The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and diesel fuel as Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez pressed her back against the crumbling concrete wall. Her radio crackled with static, then silence. The communication tower 3 clicks north had gone dark 20 minutes ago, severing her squad's lifeline to command. Now she was alone with a decision that could change everything. Maria checked her rifle magazine for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Empty. Her sidearm held 2 rounds. Behind her, the abandoned supply depot stretched into shadows, its corrugated metal walls peppered with bullet holes from the morning's firefight. Somewhere in the maze of storage containers and maintenance buildings, insurgents were regrouping for another assault. The intelligence reports had been wrong. Dead wrong. What should have been a routine supply pickup had turned into a nightmare when her convoy rolled into a carefully orchestrated ambush. 3 Humvees destroyed, 8 soldiers killed, and Maria's team scattered across the compound like leaves in a storm. She had watched Sergeant Collins take shrapnel to the chest, seen Private Martinez disappear behind a wall of smoke and flame. Her earpiece buzzed with weak transmissions from the scattered remnants of her unit. Rodriguez was pinned down near the motor pool, bleeding from a leg wound. Thompson had found cover in the communications bunker, but reported movement closing in from the east. Young Private Chun, barely 19 and on his 2nd deployment, was trapped in the administrative building with no ammunition and a radio that had been damaged in the initial attack. Maria studied the tactical map she had memorized during the briefing. The depot covered 12 acres of flat desert terrain, bounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut in multiple places. The main road ran north to south along the western edge, while a secondary access road approached from the east. Between these 2 routes lay the killing field where her convoy had been destroyed. The enemy had chosen their ground well. They controlled the high ground to the north, where an old water tower provided overwatch of the entire facility. Machine gun nests had been established at strategic choke points, and sniper positions commanded every major avenue of approach. It was a textbook ambush site, and Maria's people had walked right into it. But, as she crouched in the shadows, studying the compound through the scope of her empty rifle, Maria began to see something else. The same features that made this place perfect for an ambush could be turned against the attackers. The network of buildings and storage containers that provided them with cover could become a maze of death traps. The fuel depot that had been their target could become a weapon. Her grandfather had told her stories about the old days, when Apache warriors would use the desert itself as an ally. They would lead enemy cavalry into box canyons, turn the landscape into a weapon, make the very ground beneath their feet into a trap. The desert hadn't changed, but the weapons had. Maria could work with that. She keyed her radio, broadcasting on the emergency frequency her team had established. All units, this is Eagle 6. Sound off with your status and position. Rodriguez's voice came through first, strained with pain, but steady. Eagle 3, southwest corner of motor pool. Leg wound, limited mobility. I've got maybe 30 rounds left. Thompson followed immediately. Eagle 7, communications bunker. No wounds, full ammunition load. But I'm seeing movement on my position. Chin's transmission was barely audible, static almost drowning out his words. Eagle 2, admin building, 2nd floor. No ammunition, radio damaged, but I can see the whole eastern approach from here. Maria processed the information quickly. 3 soldiers scattered across a 12-acre facility, facing an unknown number of enemies who controlled the key terrain. By every tactical manual she had studied, this was a hopeless situation. But manuals didn't account for everything. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out the items she had salvaged from the destroyed convoy. 2 smoke grenades, 1 fragmentation grenade, and a handful of zip ties. Not much to work with, but Apache warriors had defeated cavalry units with less. The fuel depot dominated the center of the compound, its massive storage tanks connected by a network of pipes and valves. During the briefing, the base engineer had explained the safety systems, the pressure release mechanisms, and the emergency shutdown procedures. Information that had seemed routine then took on new significance now. Maria studied the wind patterns, watching how the desert breeze moved the dust and debris across the compound. The wind was coming from the northwest, steady at about 10 knots. perfect for what she had in mind. She began moving through the shadows, using the network of abandoned equipment and storage containers for cover. Each step was calculated, each movement planned to avoid the enemy's fields of observation. This wasn't about firepower anymore. This was about turning the battlefield itself into a weapon. The first stop was the maintenance shed on the eastern edge of the compound. Maria had noticed it during their initial approach, a small building that housed the facility's electrical systems. If she could reach the main power grid, she could control the lighting across the entire depot. Darkness would be her ally. She slipped through a gap in the fence and approached the shed from the blind side. The lock on the door had been shot away during the fighting, leaving it hanging open. Inside, banks of electrical panels lined the walls, their indicator lights casting an eerie glow in the dim space. Maria had cross-trained as a combat engineer before specializing in infantry tactics. She understood electrical systems, knew how to read the circuit diagrams posted on the wall. Her fingers traced the lines that controlled the exterior lighting, the floodlights that would normally illuminate the compound during night operations. But she didn't cut the power. Not yet. Instead, she began to rewire the system, connecting circuits that were never meant to be joined. When she was finished, the lighting grid would respond to her commands, but not in the way it was designed to work. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on gravel, moving with the deliberate pace of a patrol. Maria pressed herself against the wall and drew her sidearm, the weight of the 2 remaining rounds heavy in her mind. Through a crack in the door, she could see 3 insurgents moving past the shed, their attention focused on the communications bunker where Thompson was trapped. They were good, these enemies. Disciplined, well-equipped, and clearly familiar with the terrain. But they were thinking like attackers, focused on hunting down the scattered Americans. They weren't thinking about defense, about what might happen if their prey stopped running and started hunting back. Maria waited until the patrol had passed before slipping out of the shed. Her next objective was the fuel depot itself, where the Real preparation would begin. The storage tanks were massive, each one containing thousands of gallons of diesel fuel and aviation gasoline. Under normal circumstances, they were perfectly safe, protected by multiple safety systems and pressure relief valves. But circumstances were no longer normal. She reached the depot's control station, a small building that housed the monitoring equipment for the entire fuel storage system. The door was unlocked, and Maria slipped inside to find a sophisticated array of gauges, switches, and computer terminals. Everything was labeled in English and Arabic, standard procedure for facilities that might be operated by coalition forces or local contractors. The system was more complex than she had expected, but the basic principles were clear enough. Pressure, temperature, flow rates, and emergency shutdown procedures. Maria began to understand how the facility worked, how the fuel moved through the network of pipes, how the safety systems were designed to prevent exactly the kind of disaster she was now planning. She started with the pressure relief valves, the devices that were supposed to prevent the tanks from building up dangerous levels of internal pressure. Using a wrench from the maintenance kit, she began to adjust the settings slowly and carefully. Too fast, and the system's automated safety protocols would kick in. Too slow, and she wouldn't have enough time before the next enemy assault. As she worked, Maria's radio crackled with updates from her scattered team. Rodriguez reported that his position was becoming untenable, with enemy forces moving to flank the motor pool. Thompson was taking sporadic fire but holding his position. Chen remained silent, his damaged radio unable to transmit clearly. The pressure gauges began to climb as Maria continued her modifications. She was walking a tightrope now, building up enough pressure to create the effect she needed while staying below the threshold that would trigger an automatic shutdown. The fuel depot's safety systems had been designed by engineers who understood the catastrophic potential of what they were trying to prevent. Maria understood it too. That was exactly why she was doing this. Her earpiece buzzed with a transmission from Rodriguez. Eagle 6, I'm seeing movement from the north. Looks like they're massing for another push. Maria checked her watch. She had been working for 45 minutes, and the sun was beginning to set. Soon, the desert would be dark, and the enemy would have night vision advantage. Unless she changed the rules of engagement. She moved to the next phase of her plan, leaving the fuel depot and heading toward the network of storage containers that dotted the compound. These metal boxes, each one the size of a small building, had been used to store everything from vehicle parts to medical supplies. Most were empty now, but their positions created a natural maze that channeled movement through predictable corridors. Maria began to modify this maze, moving through the shadows with the zip ties she had salvaged. She secured doors that should swing free, opened passages that were meant to be closed, and created new routes through areas that had been blocked. When she was finished, the storage container maze would guide people exactly where she wanted them to go. The fragmentation grenade went into a careful position at a choke point between two containers, rigged with a simple tripwire that would be invisible in the darkness. Not a trap designed to kill, but one meant to create noise, confusion, and panic at exactly the right moment. As darkness fell over the compound, Maria made her way back toward the electrical shed. The enemy was moving again, their muzzle flashes visible in the growing gloom as they advanced on Thompson's position. They had night vision equipment, but they were about to discover that technology could be turned against them. Maria reached the electrical controls and placed her hand on the master switch she had rigged. Everything was ready. The fuel depot was building pressure, the storage container maze had been modified, and her team was in position to execute the plan she had outlined over the radio. The battlefield that had been chosen to trap her people was about to become their weapon. Maria smiled grimly and began the countdown that would turn hunters into prey. She keyed her radio one final time before the chaos began. All units, this is Eagle 6. In 60 seconds, we stop running and start fighting. Execute Plan Apache on my mark. The first phase of Maria's plan began with darkness. She threw the master switch, and the compound's exterior lighting died in sections, creating pools of shadow where bright floodlights had illuminated every corner moments before. But this wasn't a simple blackout. The modified electrical grid began its deadly dance, with lights flickering on and off in seemingly random patterns across the facility. Through her night vision scope, Maria watched the enemy reaction. The insurgents had been advancing confidently toward Thompson's position, their night vision giving them what they thought was an overwhelming advantage. Now they hesitated, confused by the strobing lights that were overloading their equipment and creating false targets in every direction. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. Eagle 6, I can see them from here. They're bunching up near the communications bunker. Looks like about 15 hostiles. Copy that, Eagle 3. Stay low and wait for my signal. Maria had positioned herself at the fuel depot's control station, her hand hovering over the valve controls she had spent 40 minutes preparing. The pressure gauges showed red across the board, well beyond normal operating parameters, but still below the catastrophic failure point. She was riding the edge of disaster, and she knew it. The enemy was adapting faster than she had hoped. Their point man began advancing again, motioning for his squad to spread out and avoid the areas where the lights were most active. These weren't amateur fighters. They understood that the American had turned the electrical system into a weapon, and they were adjusting their tactics accordingly. But they were still thinking like attackers. They were still focused on reaching their targets rather than protecting their own positions. Maria was counting on that tunnel vision. She opened the first set of valves, and diesel fuel began flowing through pipes that had never been meant to carry it. The liquid poured out of pressure relief points she had deliberately damaged, creating streams of volatile fuel that ran along predetermined paths toward the storage container maze. The smell reached the enemy positions within minutes. Maria watched through her scope as several insurgents stopped and looked around, recognizing the danger. One of them spoke urgently into his radio, probably warning his commander about the fuel leak. But by then, it was too late to change the plan. Thompson's voice came through the radio, tense but controlled. Eagle 6, they're moving into the container yard now. I count 12 hostiles approaching from the east. Roger that, Eagle 7. Chun, can you hear me? Static filled the channel for a moment before Chin's weak signal came through. Eagle. Yes, can see them, they're walking right into it. Maria smiled grimly. The storage container maze was working exactly as designed. The enemy was being channeled into a specific path, following the route of least resistance that she had created by blocking certain passages and opening others. They were moving in single file now, focused on avoiding the fuel-soaked areas while still advancing toward their objectives. She checked her watch. The fuel had been flowing for 8 minutes, and the vapors were beginning to build up in the confined spaces between the containers. Desert air was dry, perfect for carrying volatile fumes. All she needed now was the right moment and the right target. The enemy squad reached the position where Maria had placed her tripwire. The lead insurgent was careful, sweeping his path with a flashlight despite the risk of giving away his position. But, in the maze of shadows and reflected light from the modified electrical system, the thin wire was invisible until it was too late. The fragmentation grenade detonated with a sharp crack that echoed across the compound. Maria hadn't positioned it to kill, but to create noise and confusion at the exact moment when the enemy was most vulnerable. The explosion sent the squad diving for cover, their night vision equipment momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden flash. That was Maria's cue. She opened the final valve, sending a rush of aviation fuel through the system. This was the most dangerous part of her plan, the moment when she turned the compound's safety systems completely against their original purpose. Fuel poured out of the storage containers through openings she had created, mixing with the diesel already on the ground. Then, she triggered the electrical system's final surprise. The lights she had rewired began to spark, sending showers of electricity into the fuel-soaked areas around the container maze. The effect was immediate and devastating. Fire erupted across the eastern section of the compound, following the paths Maria had laid out with deadly precision. The flames raced along fuel lines toward the enemy positions, turning their chosen cover into death traps. But this wasn't a random explosion. Maria had calculated every flow rate, every pressure point, every electrical connection. The fire created a wall of flame that cut the enemy force in half, separating the squad in the container maze from the larger group advancing on Thompson's position. The insurgents trapped in the burning maze found themselves caught between walls of fire and smoke, their night vision equipment useless in the infrared chaos. All units, execute Phase 2, Maria broadcast. Rodriguez had been waiting for this moment. Despite his wounded leg, he opened fire from his position in the motor pool, his shots carefully aimed at insurgents who were silhouetted against the flames. No longer were Maria's people the hunted. The roles had reversed completely. Thompson emerged from the communications bunker and began advancing on the disoriented enemy squad that had been separated by the fire. His movement was tactical and deliberate, using the smoke and confusion to close distance while the insurgents struggled to reorganize. Chun, despite his lack of ammunition, became Maria's eyes in the sky. His position on the second floor of the administration building gave him oversight of the entire eastern approach, and his damaged radio suddenly found new clarity as the enemy's jamming equipment was abandoned in the chaos of the burning maze. Eagle 6, I can see 3 hostiles breaking north toward the water tower. They're trying to reach the overwatch position. Maria was already moving. She had saved her 2 pistol rounds for exactly this situation. The water tower was the key terrain that had given the enemy their initial advantage. If they managed to re-establish control of that position, they could direct effective fire on Maria's people even through the wall of smoke and flame. She sprinted across the open ground between the fuel depot and the base of the water tower, using the chaos and smoke for concealment. The metal ladder was old and rusted, but it held her weight as she climbed toward the platform where the enemy had established their command post. The first insurgent reached the platform just as Maria pulled herself over the edge. He was young, maybe 25, with the lean build of a desert fighter. His AK-47 was slung across his back, and he was reaching for his radio to call in a status report when he saw Maria rising from the ladder. Training took over for both of them. The insurgent went for his rifle while Maria drew her sidearm. But Maria had the advantage of surprise and superior training. Her first shot took him center mass, and he toppled backward off the platform. The second insurgent was already on the platform, and he had his weapon ready. Maria rolled left as his burst chattered overhead, the round sparking off the metal water tank behind her. She had 1 round left, and he had a full magazine. The mathematics of the situation were not in her favor, but mathematics didn't account for everything. As the insurgent adjusted his aim for a killing shot, The modified electrical system below them sent another shower of sparks into a fresh pool of fuel. The resulting explosion lit up the night sky, and the shock wave shook the water tower's ancient supports. The structure swayed, and both fighters grabbed for handholds. But Maria had climbed this ladder and knew the platform's layout. The insurgent was operating in unfamiliar territory, trying to maintain his balance while keeping his weapon trained on his target. Maria's final shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering off the platform. He stumbled, caught himself on the railing, and looked at her with a mixture of respect and resignation. "You fight like the desert spirits," he said in accented English. "My grandfather told stories of such warriors." "Your grandfather was probably right," Maria replied, keeping her empty pistol trained on him while she reached for his radio. "But this spirit has friends who need help." The view from the water tower showed her the full scope of what she had accomplished. The eastern approach was blocked by walls of fire that were beginning to burn themselves out, but had created a no-man's land between the enemy's remaining forces and her people. The container maze was a smoking ruin that had eliminated nearly half of the attacking force. But, more importantly, the psychological effect was devastating. The remaining insurgents were falling back toward their vehicles, abandoning their carefully planned assault in the face of an enemy who had turned their own battlefield against them. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, stronger now. "Eagle 6, I'm seeing multiple vehicles moving north on the access road. Looks like they're withdrawing. Copy that. All units, maintain positions and watch for stragglers." Maria used the captured radio to monitor enemy communications. The chatter was confused and demoralized. Their commander was calling for an immediate withdrawal, abandoning equipment, and wounded in their haste to escape the trap that had claimed so many of their fighters. As the last enemy vehicles disappeared into the desert night, Maria allowed herself a moment to appreciate what her grandfather would have called fighting like water. The Apache way wasn't about matching the enemy's strength with superior firepower. It was about using the land itself as an ally, about turning the battlefield into a weapon, about making the enemy's advantages into their weaknesses. Chen's voice crackled through the radio. "Eagle 6, I can see dust clouds on the horizon. Looks like cavalry coming from the west." Maria turned her scope toward the western approach and saw the beautiful sight of American vehicles racing toward the compound. The communications blackout had been temporary, and when the main base had lost contact with her convoy, they had dispatched a relief force. But the battle was already over. Maria had turned a hopeless situation into a complete victory using nothing but empty weapons, basic engineering knowledge, and the warrior wisdom that had been passed down through generations of her people. She climbed down from the water tower and walked through the smoking ruins of what had been an enemy trap. Rodriguez was limping toward the rendezvous point, his leg wound serious but not life-threatening. Thompson emerged from the communications bunker with captured equipment and intelligence materials. Chen descended from his observation post, grinning despite the exhaustion and shock. As the relief force rolled through the compound's gates, Maria surveyed the battlefield that had been transformed from a killing ground into a victory. The fuel depot was damaged but not destroyed. The storage containers could be repaired. The electrical system would need to be completely rewired. But her people were alive, the enemy was defeated, and the mission was complete. Sometimes that was all that mattered. The commanding officer of the relief force, a colonel she didn't recognize, approached her position. "Sergeant Vasquez? I'm Colonel Patterson. We need a full debrief on what happened here." Maria looked at the smoking compound, then at her 3 soldiers who had survived against impossible odds. "Yes, sir. But it's going to take a while to explain. We didn't exactly fight this one by the book." "I can see that," Patterson said, looking at the devastation around them. "From what I'm seeing here, maybe we need to write a new book." As the medics tended to Rodriguez and the intelligence officers began processing the captured equipment, Maria found herself thinking about her grandfather's stories again. The desert had been an ally tonight, just as it had been for Apache warriors a century ago. The weapons had changed, but the principles remained the same. Fight like water. Use the enemy's strength against them. Turn the battlefield itself into a weapon. It was a lesson the enemy wouldn't forget anytime soon. 3 weeks after the battle at the fuel depot, Maria sat in a sterile briefing room at Forward Operating Base Crimson, watching officers from 3 different commands study her after-action report. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a harsh contrast to the desert silence she had grown accustomed to during her deployment. Colonel Patterson sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by a general she didn't recognize, and a civilian analyst whose credentials remained mysterious. Maps of the engagement area covered the walls, marked with colored pins that showed troop movements, enemy positions, and the progression of what had been officially designated as Operation Desert Ghost. Sergeant Vasquez, the general began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his ability to shape events. Your unconventional tactics resulted in 0 friendly casualties and the complete destruction of a well-equipped insurgent cell. But they also violated approximately 17 safety protocols and created a hazardous materials situation that required a specialized cleanup crew. Maria kept her expression neutral. Yes, sir. The situation required improvisation. The civilian analyst leaned forward, his pen poised over a legal pad filled with notes. The psychological impact on enemy forces in this sector has been significant. Intelligence reports indicate that insurgent groups are avoiding the area entirely, referring to it as cursed ground. Superstition can be a powerful weapon, Maria acknowledged. But I wouldn't recommend making it standard operating procedure. Patterson smiled at that. He had been the first officer to interview her after the engagement, and his initial skepticism had given way to professional respect. The question before us today, Sergeant, is whether your methods can be adapted for training purposes. Special Operations Command wants to understand how conventional forces might employ similar tactics in resource-denied environments. The room fell silent as everyone waited for her response. Maria had spent the past 3 weeks thinking about exactly this question. The battle at the fuel depot hadn't been won through superior firepower or advanced technology. It had been won through understanding terrain, exploiting enemy expectations, and turning defensive positions into offensive weapons. The tactics can be taught, sir, but not as a checklist. What worked that night was understanding the specific environment and adapting to circumstances in real time. You can't just memorize procedures for something like this. The general nodded slowly. Explain. Maria stood and moved to the map display, pointing to the fuel depot complex that had been reconstructed in precise detail. The enemy chose this location because it offered multiple advantages: high ground for overwatch, natural choke points, and infrastructure that could be used for cover and concealment. But every advantage can become a vulnerability if you understand the system. She traced her finger along the network of buildings and storage areas. The fuel depot was their weakness, not their strength. They saw it as potential collateral damage that would limit our response options. I saw it as the largest explosive device in the compound, waiting for someone to turn it into a weapon. The civilian analyst looked up from his notes. Our engineers have calculated that your modifications to the fuel system created pressures that were less than 5% below catastrophic failure. You were operating with an extremely narrow margin of error. That's correct. But the margin was there, and I understood the system well enough to use it. The key wasn't luck. It was knowledge. Patterson leaned back in his chair. Walk us through the decision-making process. At what point did you shift from defensive to offensive thinking? Maria had been expecting this question. It went to the heart of what had made the operation successful, and what would determine whether similar tactics could be employed by other units. When I realized we had been thinking about the problem incorrectly, sir. My team was focused on survival, on finding a way out of the trap. But the enemy had invested too much in creating that trap. They had committed resources, positioned forces, and established command and control. Once I understood that they were more invested in the battlefield than we were, I realized we could afford to destroy it. The room was quiet as the officers processed this. The general finally spoke. You're saying that your tactical advantage came from being willing to accept greater destruction? In a sense, yes, sir. The enemy wanted to preserve their carefully prepared positions. I was willing to destroy the entire facility to deny them those advantages. That gave me options they didn't have. The briefing continued for another hour, with detailed questions about technical procedures, timing considerations, and the integration of conventional and unconventional tactics. But Maria could see that the real value of the session wasn't in the specific techniques she had employed. It was in the demonstration that outnumbered forces could seize initiative through creative thinking and tactical innovation. After the formal briefing concluded, Patterson asked her to remain behind. When the room had cleared, he poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermal carafe and settled into the chair across from her. Off the record, Sergeant, what really made the difference out there? Maria considered the question carefully. My grandfather used to tell stories about Apache warriors who could disappear into the landscape and reappear behind enemy lines. They didn't have better weapons or more soldiers. They had a different relationship with the environment. Different how? They saw the desert as an ally, not just terrain to fight over. Every rock, every canyon, every water source was part of their tactical system. I grew up hearing those stories, and they shaped how I think about battlefields. Patterson nodded slowly. That's not something that can be taught in a classroom. Not easily, no sir. But the principles can be understood. Use the environment as a weapon. Turn the enemy's expectations against them. Be willing to accept short-term risks for long-term advantages. Those concepts can be integrated into training. The colonel made a note on his pad. What about the personal cost? You made decisions that night that could have resulted in your own death, along with the deaths of your soldiers. Maria had been dreading this question, but she answered honestly. That's true, sir. But doing nothing would have guaranteed those deaths. Sometimes the choice isn't between risk and safety. Sometimes it's between different kinds of risk. 2 months later, Maria found herself at the Army's Urban Warfare Training Center in Louisiana, working with a team of instructors to develop new curriculum for small unit tactics in complex environments. The facility included mock buildings, industrial infrastructure, and sophisticated simulation systems that could recreate the conditions she had faced in the desert. But the most important element was the mindset training. Student soldiers learned to see every environment as a potential weapon system, to understand that defensive positions could be turned into offensive advantages, and to think beyond conventional applications of available resources. Rodriguez had recovered from his leg wound and joined the instruction team, bringing his own insights about operating under extreme conditions. Thompson specialized in communications and electronic warfare applications. Chun, despite his youth, had developed a reputation for innovative observation and intelligence-gathering techniques. The program they developed wasn't about recreating the specific conditions of the fuel depot engagement. It was about teaching soldiers to think like Maria had thought, to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles, and to understand that tactical innovation could overcome material disadvantages. The first class of students included soldiers from conventional infantry units, special operations candidates, and international military officers participating in exchange programs. Maria watched them struggle with scenarios that required creative problem-solving rather than standard procedures. The hardest part isn't teaching them the techniques, she explained to Patterson during one of his visits to the facility. It's teaching them to trust their own judgment when the situation doesn't match what they learned in training. One particular exercise involved students defending a chemical plant against a simulated attack. Like the fuel depot, the facility included infrastructure that could be dangerous if mishandled, but potentially useful if properly understood. Most student teams focused on establishing defensive perimeters and calling for reinforcement. But one team, led by a young lieutenant named Morrison, began studying the plant's industrial systems. They identified ways to use steam pressure, electrical systems, and chemical processes to create obstacles and hazards for attacking forces. Their solution was unconventional, risky, and brilliant. That's exactly the kind of thinking we're trying to develop, Maria told the class during the after-action review. Lieutenant Morrison's team understood that their greatest weapons weren't their rifles and radios. Their greatest weapons were the systems that surrounded them. The program evolved over time, incorporating lessons learned from subsequent engagements where soldiers had successfully applied similar principles. Maria received reports from Afghanistan, Iraq, and training exercises around the world where small units had turned environmental factors into tactical advantages. But the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent groups had modified their own tactics in response to the fuel depot engagement. They were avoiding facilities with complex infrastructure, changing their approach to urban warfare, and developing new training programs focused on countering ghost tactics. "We changed how they think," Patterson observed during a quarterly review. That might be more valuable than any specific engagement. Maria had been promoted to staff sergeant and was being considered for selection to the Special Operations Community. The commendation letters in her personnel file described her as an innovative tactical thinker and an example of adaptive leadership under extreme conditions. But she still thought about that night in the desert, about the moment when she had looked at an impossible situation and decided to stop thinking like a victim. The technical details were important, the tactical procedures were valuable, and the training applications were useful. But the real lesson was simpler than all of that. Every environment contained potential weapons. Every disadvantage could become an advantage if properly understood. And sometimes the best way to escape a trap was to turn it inside out and make it work for you instead of against you. Standing in the Louisiana training facility, watching new soldiers learn to think beyond conventional limitations, Maria realized that her grandfather's stories had come full circle. The old Apache wisdom about fighting like water, about using the land as an ally, about making the enemy's strength into their weakness, was being passed on to a new generation of warriors. The weapons had changed, the battlefields had evolved, and the enemies were different. But the fundamental principles remained constant. In the end, victory belonged to those who could adapt, who could see possibilities where others saw only problems, and who were willing to risk everything on their ability to turn the battlefield itself into their greatest weapon. Maria's radio crackled with a transmission from the exercise control tower. "Eagle 6, this is Control. Exercise complete. All units return to base." She smiled at the familiar call sign and keyed her response. "Control, this is Eagle 6. Roger that. All units returning to base." Some traditions were worth keeping, even as the tactics evolved. The spirit of the Apache warriors lived on, adapted to new weapons and new battlefields, but fundamentally unchanged in its commitment to turning impossible odds into unexpected victories. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the specific techniques or the detailed procedures, but the understanding that no situation was truly hopeless as long as someone was willing to think differently about it. Maria watched her students pack up their equipment and prepare for the next exercise, and she knew that the lessons of the fuel depot would live on long after the details were forgotten. They had learned to fight like water, to use the desert as an ally, and to turn their enemies' greatest advantages into their own weapons. It was exactly what her grandfather would have wanted.